Hello everyone, and just as we were coming on stream, Tim kindly remembered that I have to record this on a backup, so I'm just doing that now at the same time as I am saying hello and good evening and welcome to the Alliance of Independent Authors Beginners Salon this month, where we're going to be talking all about editing. And I'm here with Tim Lewis. Hi, Tim.
Hi, Orna.
Welcome to another Alliance of Independent Authors Beginners Salon. And you're just back from your holidays, right?
Well, it's not holidays. Clearly, all business. I went to a conference in San Diego, but I also went to Boise in Idaho beforehand, and also Santa Fe. And I've got a T-shirt, a very cheap T-shirt I've been wearing since. So yes, I suppose it was a holiday in a way. So yes, I was away from
to you, Mister. I know it's not business. Well, it's half. It's hard for us to separate business and pleasure when you love what you do. Yeah. So today we've got quite a bit to talk about because we're talking about a really important topic of editing, and it's a big topic for authors, and especially when you're starting out. I think this is our beginner salon where we speak to people who are at the earlier stages. Though I know that we have listeners who listen in at all stages of the process, and some people who've been doing this for quite a while. For us all, editing is absolutely key. So do you want to just say quickly why that is? Because I know that there are still some independent authors who need to be convinced of this, because of course editing is expensive. It's one of the most expensive investments that we have to make, and there is some resistance to that. Can you talk first of all about why it's so important?
Well, I think the basic reason why editing is important in any activity. I mean, I came from a IT world. I used to be software development, and there was always big pushback there for having software go through quality assurance testing and going through like having a second pair of eyes looking at it. And it was for kind of similar reasons, in as much as it's extra time and expense and having that second look of it. But when you work with a good editor, in the same way when you work with a good software tester, it's all about the fact that you are making use of both a second perspective, which is important in itself, because you are so invested in your own work that you may be totally blind to all sorts of major faults. And also the fact that you are making use of their experience in testing or in editing a book. And so this is especially true with genre work, where you've got an editor who really knows that genre. So, for example, with some of my books, my mum was an editor, like in general, like way ago in the 1960s. But because I've switched genres, I think I may have got better service from somebody who really understood the genre. Because as we talked about in previous episodes, there are things that are different and expected in certain genres and certain things. And if they're missing, then that can put somebody off. And somebody who is an editor who has experience in a particular genre or particular type of writing can really, really help you spot the things that are wrong in your, well, not wrong, but can be improved in your manuscript. So I think an editor, I mean, if you're only doing a 20-page book, then maybe an editor is not essential. But if you're doing any kind of serious work, then you really do need to have an editor of some variety. And the more skilled and more specific to your genre, the better.
Yes, and of course, at AskALLi, we define a book as something coming in around 50,000 words or similar. So yeah, at that level, editing is essential, and especially at the beginning. And the difficult thing, I think, is that at the very time where you have least money, you know, you're not getting any income, it's your first book, you haven't, it's all still also new to you, and you've got so many other things going on. The idea of committing this amount to the amount of money and the amount of time and the handing it over, the taking the critique, all of these things are much more challenging first time out. And so the very time when you most need it is the very time when it's most challenging. But we really urge everybody to get the best editing you can afford, and see it over and over and over again, that when people find the right editor, that's when their career takes off. Because an editor it's a learning experience. So it's not just an investment in that one book, it's an investment in you as a writer. And you will learn so much from your first edit, more than almost you've learned just from writing the book yourself. It's a hugely rewarding and interesting and growing experience if you open yourself up to it. And so it really is a huge investment in you as a writer. So think of it in those terms, that you will be getting a repayment on this investment all the way through all the books that are going to be coming down the track. And also, we always say that your editor is actually your first marketer and your best marketer, because if you don't get your book edited, it won't be as good as it could be. And that goes for everybody. You know, the people who have been writing forever, Stephen King, his next book will have an editor. And, you know, everybody, no matter how experienced, needs that. And yeah, so okay, try not to labor the point anymore. There are, however, 3 different types of editing. And again, at the beginning, you're likely to need them all. You're likely to need more editing than you need later on when you're more experienced and you know all the tropes of your genre and so on. So the 3 kinds of editing are developmental editing, line editing, sometimes called copy editing, and then a proofreading at the end. So I think while most writers will now recognize the need for proofreading, the resistance often comes in for that developmental edit. So your genre person that you're talking about, were they a developmental editor?
Well, no, as I say, I basically use the same editor all the time. It was just general editor. So, but I think that you're right, as in I can see that a developmental editor would be phenomenal, certainly for starting writer and for somebody who knows. I mean, I think there's a lot. I mean, I've heard a lot of stories, and maybe this is you in your AskALLi role would know about that, how important the personality fit is between the editor and the actual writer. So it's not just a case of an editor being really good. If they don't have the kind of personality and relationship with the writer. So, I mean, yeah, I think probably, shall we start with just explaining the difference between those 3 types of editing? So
I think that's really necessary. Yeah. So I'll take developmental edit then first, but just to pick up on your point before leaving it, because I think you raised a really interesting point there around personality. Again, another thing that we kind of say is that finding an editor, you know, finding the editor is like finding a spouse. You know, it is that important, and it's that personal, and there's, you know, there is sort of personal chemistry issues there, as well as things like just how they give the feedback, the kind of language they use, whether that fits yours, you know, whether they are, if you are highly creative, you know, that they can account for that and allow for that while pinning down the things they need to pin down, and so on. And yeah, so this is a trial and error thing, and it may take, in fact, it almost always does, I think, if you get the right editor first time out, that's pretty lucky. But regardless, no matter, even if you don't get on that well with them at the beginning, even if they're not the perfect person, you'll still learn a huge amount. So don't say, okay, this is the perfect editor for me, I don't need, you know, I'm going to wait this time and see if I can get the right person next time. It's still a really valuable learning experience, even with that in place. So developmental, particularly, well, again, with each of these, we have to talk slightly differently in the 3 big genre divisions of fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. So very often advice around developmental editing focuses on fiction writing. So there you're talking about issues around the story. consistency across the storyline. These are what you might call the big issues, the structural issues. Sometimes it's called structural editing. It can be called content editing sometimes, or substantive editing. One of the things you realize when you go looking for an editor is how confusing all these different terms are. There isn't an agreed sort of definition, but there really are only the three types. And so I'm going to stick with the word developmental edit, because I think that's the most useful, in that they do develop the book. So it's like a screen, a script in screenwriting goes into development, and we don't have that same concept quite as authors in publishing, because a lot of that goes on behind the scenes than it does in screenwriting. So what they will do is they will flag up any big inconsistencies. If you've got a big hole in the middle of it that didn't even realize you had, if your logic in a nonfiction book is not holding through start to finish, if there's a chapter that should be there that isn't there, if you've quoted two different people and haven't noticed, all of those kind of big picture, I suppose, issues is what you would talk about. In poetry, it's a little bit more subtle, and it's more like a teaching role with poetry, because that's a short piece, and lots of poets don't hire editors on the basis that the work is short. But again, I think there's a huge amount of value in having a poetry editor, especially at the beginning. They can teach you so much about form and language and how those two things come together, and lots of stuff that you may have learned in English class and didn't really understand at all when you were considering other authors, but that begin to make sense for you when you actually look at it in terms of your own writing. So anything to add on the developmental, or do you want to talk about the line editing, copy editing thing?
Well, I don't really want to talk about it, but no. I mean, the funny thing is that there are gradual kind of. It's not like three nice buckets that you can put all these editing things in. There are lines between them. I mean, developmental editing also kind of overlaps with writing coaches, and I mean, you could say that even ghostwriting is extreme developmental editing, i.e. the other person actually writes it for you. More the line editing is more to do with how your sentences and structures and how everything works in terms of, so it's not the spelling and it's not like the individual things, but how does it sound? How does the text flow? Not so bothered about plot points or the actual story, but it's to do with like making your book sound and read as good as possible. So things like repeating words would be something I would guess that would be more in the line editing side. Though again, maybe that's in the proofreading side, because the trouble is proofreading is different for print than for ebooks because of the nature of the two things. So it's kind of like it's a spectrum of editing that's available, from like where somebody is really holding your hand and telling you about like everything, to kind of like trying to make your structure, your actual writing skills better by showing you what needs to be changed. Then all the way to proofreading, which is more about how your actual spelling mistakes and how your book is actually structured in terms of a paper book. So it comes from the old concept of proofs, where in printing you used to have a proof where you went through and you created the print that you were actually going to put on these little tablets on the printing machines. So proofreading is checking the proofs had no spelling mistakes and that you didn't have like an extra word on one page and that kind of an orphan or that kind of thing. With ebooks, because of the flowability of it, that element of proofreading is probably less relevant, but you still got spelling mistakes and like grammatical issues and the rest of it. So that's kind of the other extreme of this spectrum of editing that we're talking about.
Exactly. And I think that the ones that people do tend to mix up and not know for sure which one they need is that gray area between the copy editing or the line editing, as it's sometimes called, and the proofreading. So a lot of authors would say to me, well, if somebody's going to fix up the spellings and everything, why do I need this? What's this line editing doing if it's not doing that? And it's the hardest one to explain, and it's the one that will probably have the most effect in terms of reader enjoyment. Well, that's not fair to say, they all do, but it's just it's about the language, and you use the word flow, and I think that's exactly it. It's very hard work writing long form. You know, once you go over 10,000 words, the sentence fatigue sets in. You don't recognize sometimes when you kind of dropped the ball and your sentence maybe doesn't even make any sense at all, but probably does satisfy grammatically, is fine. But it could be said in a better way, or you've used far too many, say, passive constructions, or you got repetition that you don't realize you have. And that can be repetition not just of words, though that definitely does happen, where people use the same words over and over again, or the same little phrases, but also repetition of effect. So that when perhaps you have a scene structure, you know, 4 or 5 or 6 times within the book, and you don't even realize you've done that essentially somebody else picks up on those kinds of things. So that will be at the structural level. Well, the same thing can happen at the language level, where you're using phrases, dialogue forms. You see a lot with beginner writers where the dialogue takes a similar sort of pattern over and again. And while you do want your characters to speak in identifiable voices, you don't want the dialogue to become repetitious in any way. So it's again, it's a subtle thing. And yeah, as you say, Tim, where it breaks down, nobody can draw a line and say categorically that's on the line editing side, that's on the proofreading side for everything. It's important that you have 2 different people do your line edit and your proofreading if you can. It really does make a difference, because by the time your line editor has done the line edit, they like you are now too close to the text and don't have quite what it takes to do a very accurate proofread. This isn't as important as it used to be with machine editing. So lots of editors now will use some kind of software to help them in proofreading and in line editing. So it's not quite as important as it used to be at that, but still I think it's helpful. And also with every editor you work with, you learn a little bit more. So yeah, any other tips then for working with the editor?
No, of course. It's a personal thing working with an editor. You have to be prepared to emotionally detach a bit from your work, so that you don't take it personally, and also I realize on the other extreme that you don't have to necessarily take any notice of what the editor says. You are the person who is paying them, and it's a contractual relationship. But you need to be questioning yourself if you're saying, if you just keep overriding whatever the editor says all the time, then that's an issue. To take things...
Go ahead, yeah.
No, I was going to take things off on a tangent to just describe why editing is important in general. Something came to my mind. If somebody was editing this podcast from a developmental point of view, they'd probably say that I should have said this earlier on. So that's an example. But there's a video on YouTube where they go through the edits they made to the first Star Wars film from an editing point of view. And it's phenomenal, the changes they made in post-production, because anybody who knows the history of Star Wars knows that he had this big presentation to people like Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma, and they all thought it was rubbish. They thought it was a terrible film that would never succeed. Now, that's because they saw the pre-edited version of Star Wars. So just as an example about how they changed it in the edit, right at the end, there's the big scene where Luke Skywalker's going down the trench run in the Death Star. In the original version, the Rebel base wasn't under threat at all. They just had it as them flying off to blow up the Death Star. they added all. If you watch the first Star Wars film, every single scene at the end of it where they've got like the little clock and the timer saying like, oh, it's going to be in range soon, that is all added from stock footage. None of that has any of the characters because they added it all in the edit. So
fascinating.
That's kind of an example of how good editing can make something that was kind of like meh into like really good from a developmental point of view, because it was developmental editing. They basically chopped the whole thing up. So the original Star Wars was very different from the one that we actually ended up seeing. So that was my tangent that I was talking about.
Good. It's good. But and I will definitely be going off to take a look because I'm always fascinated by what an editor brings. And I also feel that editors should be given a lot more credit in our books, and generally for the work. And I know some authors who really feel that their career is down to their editor. And I know some editors in traditional publishing who have handled a stellar cast of writers, and you can see when you know that they're the editor, you can actually see their work in play across very different styles. So it's a huge creative skill in itself, and it deserves more, more credit is due. And editors tend to be very, a bit self-effacing, and they're interested in the work rather than being out there being the star or whatever. But they definitely deserve a huge amount of credit, more credit than I feel the traditional publishing industry has afforded them, where they have been very much, kept in the background. And I think it's interesting, one of the things that's happening with the indie author movement is that authors are actually acknowledging their editors much more and talking about them and bringing them out to the front. So just a few tips then on actually working with your editor. Tim you mentioned earlier, seeking an editor who's comfortable in your genre. That's really important. Somebody who has specialized in a particular genre, particular type of, if it's nonfiction, in your subject matter, they're going to bring their expertise, and that's absolutely fantastic. And different editors have particular strengths, and it's good to think about, can you find somebody who's kind of strong where you're weak? So if you know, for example, that you're not great at dialogue or structure, getting an editor who's very good at that. Or if you're not great on description, somebody who's good on those kinds of things, seek them out. Another thing to think about is nationality and region. Are you going to write the two major forms of English, US or UK? Which one are you going to do? And does your editor have expertise in that? And you should have some kind of style guide that is a basis of what you will work on. If you don't know what I mean by style guide, essentially it's just decisions around conventions, like when do numbers get written out as words, for example, or do you use the Oxford comma or not, that kind of stuff. If you don't have one already, that's absolutely fine. As a beginning self-publisher, you're not likely to have one. But as you work with editors, begin to agree, come to a sense of your own house style, of what your preferences are, and make those, set up a style guide for yourself, so that the next editor you work with, you can actually tell them what your preferences are around that. In terms of hiring somebody, it's good to actually test with a sample edit. So you can ask them to send, you send them a sample of your work, and then ask them to take a look at it. And, very often they will quote you a price based on that work. Editors are sometimes reluctant to quote prices up front, because it does really vary hugely depending on the writer's skills. But at AskALLi, we ask that all our partner members at least give a range of where they begin and end, because this is something that can vary so hugely among editors that I think authors need to have some sense of what it might cost them. But it is going to vary hugely depending on your own writing and the editor's expertise, and how long they've been in business, and how much they value themselves essentially as well. What else? I think those are the major things to think about. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Tim?
Well, something I recommend people doing, which I kind of did myself a little bit, but two things that for your first book project, unless you think you're only ever going to write one book, which is quite a negative attitude, you probably want to be looking for something that's fairly short relative to what your other work you want to create, and also isn't your big passion project. So that you can like afford to give it the attention it deserves in terms of editing, because editing a shorter work is going to be cheaper than editing a longer work in general. And also because you're probably if it's like this thing that you've been willing to, your passion project that you've been wanting to get out of it, then that's possibly not the best first project to work on with an editor. You probably want to be able to, and you will also, even if you hire an editor you don't really get on with, at least you'll learn what you need to work on, because they will almost certainly tell you. So I think there's something in terms of your career, in terms of writing. Maybe the first one should be a short thing that you're fairly confident about in whatever genre you're interested in. Learn all the ropes, learn how the editing process works, learn what kind of editing you need and who you need to focus on. And then maybe in the next book, if you're lucky, you'll get the great editors you want in the first book and it'll be cheap enough. But if you don't, then it's like, well, it's a short work, you've not spent that much on it. And then for the later projects, you can start really, because the more books you write, the better you're going to get, both in self-editing and in choosing people and in the whole marketing process and everything. So that's why I always kind of say to people, write something short to start with, if you can, and then go onwards with and that applies because of the editing costs and everything else. So that would be my advice.
It's really great advice, and if you can take it, I wish I had. I started my writing career with a ridiculously long and ambitious project, which eventually broke down into 3 books. Crazy stuff. But something else you said earlier is also relevant here, in that you mentioned the relationship that you have with the editor, that you're paying them. So this is slightly different to the way in which traditional publishing has worked, where you hand over the manuscript, basically they choose the editor for you, and it's sink or swim. You either get on with them or you don't. And as we've already said, you will learn anyway, so don't worry too much about that. But what can happen sometimes, and again, it won't with an experienced editor, but sometimes beginner authors end up with beginner editors because of cost factors. And what can happen in that case, and in terms of the relationship, is that because you're hiring, in a sense, you don't get, the editor should lead in this stage of the process. And that's quite difficult for the author. Sometimes it gets much easier as you get more experience, but at the beginning, when it's this precious baby, and this is another reason to kind of do what you're saying, Tim, to do a lighter project that isn't like your absolute baby as your first time out. But if it is, something to check in with is your level of emotion to the responses. So if you're finding yourself irritated, upset, if emotion is running high in you as you are responding to the edit, that may not be a personality issue. That just might be that you need to take the attitude that is appropriate for an author and need some practice of that. Because a lot of us do, starting off, and we're very sensitive about the work. It's very exposing to give it to somebody else and to get it back. It reminds us of school as well, and possibly previous humiliations at the hands of horrible teachers. And, there are all sorts of things going on here. And the learning experience is as much in that whole thing of learning how to accept that as it is in actually improving the writing. So there are tips online, and if you check out the Self-Publishing Advice Centre, we have a number of articles about editing, which you can look at there. And in terms of, Carl Drinkwater has written a good post about how to take the criticism, if you like, the right attitude to bring to reading your edit. Don't, make sure you give plenty of time and space to it, that you sit down with a cup of coffee, read it through, observe your own responses and reactions, and allow some time to cool off if you need that before you begin to think about what you do and don't do. You should be taking the notes from your editor and analyzing them. As Tim said earlier, you're the person who will make the ultimate decision, but if you find, as he said, that you're rejecting loads of them, or if you find that you are highly emotional about it, then the right attitude, the right place to be in, is to have a cool head while you are actually taking the notes on board, so you can make good decisions.
Yeah.
So just briefly before we leave, we're almost out of time. Editing UK has popped in to say hello, an ALLi partner member, and that answers a question from somebody else here. Walt has asked, any hints on how to find a developmental editor? So we have a directory of all our partner members, Walt, across the 7 stages of the publishing process, which Tim and I are going to be covering in coming months. And so if you check out the directory, everybody there has been vetted by the ALLi Watchdog Desk, and you can begin your investigations there. So anything to say before we bow out? It is
no, apart from to point out to anybody who is expecting a Twitter chat, there's not going to be a Twitter chat today, but I suspect at some point we may be having more regular Twitter chats.
Yes,
not necessarily based on the show.
We've both been away. I have been on my absolute holidays with no business involved, and Tim was away, so we didn't do the session on Tuesday as usual, though it will go out at the usual time on the Saturday podcast. But yes, we feel that a Twitter chat after the ALLi chats, after the ALLi sessions, would be useful for people to go and kind of talk about the issues afterwards. So we're going to try and set up a weekly, and we'll let you know in the Member magazine about exactly what we decide around that. But it will be on Tuesday evenings, and we'll be back with the Facebook live session on Tuesday, on the first, is it the first Tuesday? Yeah, the first Tuesday.
First Tuesday, yeah.
First Tuesday next month with the Beginners Salon again. And next month we'll be in the next stage of the publishing process, which is all about design and what you need to think about there. And that one will be followed by a Twitter chat then. But if you do have any questions, please put them in the comments here and we will address them afterwards. And of course, you can contact us anytime on all the usual addresses and places. So hopefully that was useful to you as you consider the editorial process. And thank you for being here with us this evening.